It's great to have all of you with us this evening for this ACFID session on discussing locally led and what it means for CEOs and boards as we consider how we lead our organizations. I'm Matthew Morey. I'm the interim CEO for ACFID. I've met many of you, but not all of you, but really pleased to have a good turnout tonight. I will introduce our guest speakers as we go through the agenda. But as we kick off, I wanted to just welcome all of you and thank you for making time in an evening as we have the session tonight. I also want to acknowledge that for my colleagues that are with me here in Canberra, we're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. Sorry, and I've got a guy, sorry, not right now, vacuuming my room. Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, and just pay my respects to elders past and present. And acknowledge that you are all around the country meeting on traditional land. And I certainly extend my respect to Indigenous and First Nations people who might be present with us today as well. We have an agenda that's going to feature Dylan Matthews, who's joining us from London, and I will give him a formal introduction shortly. And we'll have some time to hear from him and then some question and answer space. So please, listen to what he has to say, jot down your notes or your questions, and we'll have a chance for some discussion. And then we have one of our members, Billy from This Life Cambodia, sharing with us about their experiences with locally led, and then talk about where to from here at the end of the session as well. So we expect to fill the whole hour and a half. And as I said, pleased that you were able to make time to join us for this. As I mentioned, our two speakers, Dylan and Billy, are with us. Billy is one of ACFID's members here in Australia, and Dylan will be sharing with us from the UK. So we appreciate him getting up a little bit earlier to do this session in a time that works for us. It's easy as we talk about locally led to get caught up in the semantics. And I think this has been one of the big challenges for our sector, understanding what we mean and how we define what locally led is. There's a lot of different definitions that are used globally. So we thought it would be helpful as we start to have a consistent way that we're talking about it. And for us, pointing to what the ACFID code is the most helpful definition, since that code is what all of you as members of ACFID have signed on to. I'm not going to read this out verbatim, but there are sections that are highlighted in bold, and I'll call your attention to those. So key elements of what we mean by locally led are the fact that it focuses on leadership and decision-making of local actors and recognizing the need to talk about and address power imbalances in our organizations and the way we work. We acknowledge that this will look different for different organizations. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but the ACFID code highlights that partnerships, direct funding, transparency, mutual accountability, staffing and leadership are key areas that contribute to how we actually live into this commitment to locally led action. In the Australian context, there's a couple of things to note, one of which is the international development policy that our government put out in 2023. And we were pleased that it does highlight and make explicit commitments around aspects of locally led development, including supporting local leadership across different aspects of society, ranging from government to business to academia, and also civil society. And following on from the international development policy came DFAT's guidance note, which was on locally led development. That came out last year. And this sets out the policy rationale for Australia's commitment to locally led development and has some suggestions about how and when to adopt a locally led development approach in Australia's aid delivery program. It also sets out a range of performance indicators that the Australian government is using to measure how we're doing and how they're doing with the aid program and achieving locally led. For ACFID and our journey, and I think all of our organizations have been on a journey as we grapple with what it means to be committed and live into commitments to locally led. We've been on our own journey as ACFID. This road shows you some of the key markers. I will let you look at it on your own, but I'll highlight a couple aspects that are important. One of the key pieces of work was certainly the commitment of the inclusion of the new requirements in the ACFID code, which reflect how all of our members have to be committed to locally led development. And I'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment. But I also want to recognize that a lot of the journey and the work that ACFID's been on has been supported by you, our members, by the work of the different communities of practice who have contributed to our thinking and our practice around this, and also the Development Practice Committee at ACFID. We've also, as part of this journey, been actively working with the government, with DFAT, as part of their reference group to support the development of the guidance note that I've already mentioned. And we continue to look for ways that we can actively engage with DFAT and the wider sector on specific initiatives. This evening is just one example of us trying to create more opportunities for discussion about what it means for leaders of organizations. The ACFID code, I've mentioned a couple of times, and it's important as we start to just reference what it says about your commitments to locally led, all of you who are members of ACFID. It was developed following an 18-month review process and approved in 2023. So hopefully it isn't new to all of you, but I recognize that some of you might not have spent as much time with it. It makes explicit the commitments that we require of our members to locally led. All of the ACFID's work on the code is underpinned by the principles of proportionality and flexibility, recognizing the diversity of our membership, and recognizing as well that approaches and ways that you adopt this are going to be unique to each of your organization. These changes have come into effect already, so they're actively, in 2023, they were approved, and then with all changes to the code, there's a time period that organizations have to adjust and adapt and get ready to be fully compliant, and they have, the code now is active, so all of your organizations are meant to be compliant. And I'll call out the 3 points here that you have agreed to as members of the code. You've agreed to have an organizational commitment to locally led action, which is evidenced by policy, a statement, or a guidance document. So those would be things that your board would have signed off on and been involved with. You're committed to have evidence of naming and addressing power imbalances in your organizational relationships. And this would be relevant to the ways that you do your development and humanitarian initiatives, probably seen through your program teams and the program work. And also you need to contribute to locally led action as evidenced by the voice and decision-making of local actors in all stages of a program, the allocation of resources, the design and evaluation and feedback and complaints mechanisms. The next slide talks about some other aspects of the code that you've agreed to. Again, highlighted in bold are some of the points to call your attention to around the commitments of partnership, how you do your communication materials, how you manage risk with members, and how you even approach things like research that you might be doing in evaluations. The ACFID code, all of you who've engaged with it will recognize that there's compliance requirements, and then there's good practice indicators. And these are the parts of the code where they're not required, but they encourage all of our ACFID members to be saying, how can we raise the bar and continue to progress in our work on any of the ACFID code aspects. And for the commitments to locally led, there are good practice indicators which focus on how you do collaboration with other INGOs and donors, as well as how you enable feedback into your processes. So that gives you an overview and hopefully a common language as we talk about what it means to be an ACFID member and what we mean when we use the language of locally led. I now want to introduce our first and main speaker tonight, which is Dylan Matthews. Dylan is the CEO of Peace Direct, having joined that organization about a decade ago in 2015. His commitment to supporting local organizations in the Global South spans almost 20 years, during which time he has worked for a range of international development, humanitarian, and peace-building organizations. While at Peace Direct, Dylan has led the organization's decolonizing systems work, which led to the publication of the landmark report, Time to Decolonize Aid, which all of you hopefully have seen, but if not, we'll make sure the links to that are shared. That was published in 2021. Dylan is also currently the chair of the board of Civicus, one of the largest alliances of civil society organizations worldwide. And I was just mentioning to him before we started the session, he gave a fantastic plenary presentation at ACFID conference a couple of years ago, and many of his points have stuck with me and continue to resonate. So I really look forward to what he has to share tonight. Thanks for being with us, Dylan.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to share my screen and just talk you through a few slides in relation to the transformation that the sector is undergoing in relation to decolonising and locally led action, and hopefully provide some food for thought for you. So let me just see if this is working. Right, can I just check? Can everyone see my slides? Yeah, great, wonderful. So sector transformation and unfinished business is how I'm describing this. Just a little bit about us. Matthew just mentioned a little bit about Peace Direct. We're a UK-based INGO. We've been working with local peace builders around the world to stop violence and build sustainable peace, with a very strong focus on shifting power and resources in the international system towards locally led efforts. And for the past 20 years, we've really felt very strongly that the international system needs radical reform, particularly in how it prioritizes top-down and external efforts over local efforts. So over the years, we've embarked on lots of research, consultations with local actors and advocacy to really understand what the dysfunctions are in the sector and how the sector can become better aligned towards really supporting and centering around the agency and the dignity of local actors. We accelerated that work, I think, probably in the last 10 years. And from about 2020 onwards, we have consulted widely with Global South civil society actors. I think the current count is well over 1,000 civil society actors have been part of our consultations. And that has led to the publication of a number of reports. Matthew mentioned one of them, the Time to Decolonize Aid there. But there are others that I'd encourage you to have a look at as well. One around the 9 roles that intermediaries can play in international cooperation. And most recently, one around partnerships, which is the subject of the talk I gave at the ACFID conference a few years ago. We will be releasing other publications soon. So really trying to promote and encourage the sector to continue to think about its transformation and the sort of work that civil society actors and communities are asking us to do. So my presentation today is going to be a sort of revisiting of some of the commitments that we have made in the past, the sector, but also a reminder of what civil society said were the problems in the sector. And so we can take do a bit of a stock take on where we've got to. So just quickly on the external context, you all know this, but I think it just sets the scene a little bit. Since locally led became a very prominent agenda, I think there has been some progress. So this is not all doom and gloom, and I think we should all recognize what has happened. I think there's been a widespread acknowledgement that there are problems in the sector. Some have been very explicit about calling it a sort of neo-colonial attitudes within the sector, which is great. And the decolonizing agenda has become much more prominent as a result. Some of you will have heard of the Pledge for Change. The Pledge for Change is an initiative spearheaded by about a dozen large multi-mandate INGOs and driven actually by a Global South organization called ADESO, really tried to transform their practice. You will have heard probably of the OECD recommendation on enabling civil society. That came out a few years ago, and it commits all OECD DAC members to really tackling power imbalances, doing a lot more around supporting locally led efforts. Shift the Power movement has grown exponentially over the last 5 or so years and has become a dynamic, vibrant movement of activists really trying to push for change in the sector. Of course, you will have all heard of the localization agenda and the Grand Bargain Agreement. We know that it has stalled, and we know that there are difficulties, but we also have to recognize that that was a statement of intent around trying to get more funding to local actors. And then most recently, a couple of years ago, there was the donor statement on locally led development, signed by about 20 bilateral donors, as well as a large number of the world's biggest private philanthropies, really committing themselves to funding more local actors and, again, tackling power imbalances. So there has been some progress made sort of at the geopolitical and the sector level. There's also been a lot of stalled progress. We have seen that INGOs are scrambling to preserve their funding. And what that has meant, and this is in the words of some of the Global South actors that we've spoken to, a localization spin. In other words, INGOs saying that they're doing localization, but not really committing to it. And that's particularly the case when it comes to country offices, that lots of local actors have said to us, they're now repositioning themselves as local organizations and competing with us for funding. There's a lot of paralysis in the system when it comes to tackling systemic racism. People haven't known how to take the first step into the decolonizing journey, so they haven't taken any step. So they might have acknowledged the problem, but they haven't made enough progress in actually shifting their attitudes and their practices. And of course, most recently, I think we should just recognize, there's a wholesale dismantling of overseas aid by the US administration, the attack on progressive causes, and very sadly, the dramatic reduction in overseas aid budgets across Europe and beyond. And all of that is then forcing INGOs to think about their own survival. And maybe the risk we are seeing is that might then bring all of these sort of the change agenda back a few steps as we think about our own organizations rather than the work that we're supposed to be doing and the communities that should be taking a lead in that. So that's setting the scene for you. I wanted to now just really remind you of just the problems in the sector as seen through the eyes of local civil society. So this diagram, some of you may be familiar with, it comes from our first report, Time to Decolonize Aid, that came out in 2021. We have since used this and consulted with local actors around the world. It is still very valid, and we'll talk about what progress has been made later. But I just want to briefly remind you of some of the problems as they mentioned it to us. The first is the problematic attitudes right in the center, that we know best, we're the experts. This deficit thinking approach, which suggests that communities lack the expertise and the capacity, in inverted commas, to do the work, and therefore they need us to provide the technical skills and the know-how to do the work. And so that problematic attitude, which is what some people call the sort of neo-colonial attitude that we have in the sector, has led to these 9 different manifestations of the problem. And I'll go very quickly through some of them. And I think this is useful to start with strategies, because I'm aware, as Matthew mentioned, that there are board members on this call. Local actors have said to us, why is it that the organizational strategies of most INGOs seem to be based on an idea of growth and expansion? In other words, we're going to do more, we're going to get bigger, we're going to help more people. Now, on the surface, that sounds all very laudable. Of course, we want to help more people. Of course, we want to support more communities. But what we've heard time and time again from local organizations is that is predicated on this notion that our expertise is always necessary, and the way in which we grow, primarily through country offices, primarily through direct implementation, suggests that there is no local capacity. And they absolutely reject that. They say, rather than thinking about growth and expansion, why don't you think about a strategy that really shifts the power and the resources to local actors rather than concentrating the power with you? So they're very, very critical of INGO strategies. And I think that's I guess a provocation for you all, a challenge for you all about how board members can be involved in all the sort of strategy development process. There's a lot of critique around knowledge generation and analysis. They have said to us time and time again, why is it that the production and consumption of knowledge is for and by global North actors? So it's very rarely investing in indigenous knowledge generation. It's about the knowledge that we produce. Even if it's on countries around the world, it's Somalia, Syria, where it might be. So this virtuous circle of the production and consumption of knowledge, all about the global North actors and their stakeholders. They are very critical of the funding landscape. They say the funding is just not accessible to them. In fact, in some cases, they are barred from entry. There's very, very high barriers to entry for them. The funding seems to go to the same organizations. They are concerned about the language. They say, why are we still using the same language? They talk about problematic language like beneficiaries or capacity building that they say still diminishes the agency and dignity of local actors. They're worried about relationships. They say these relationships that INGOs form tend to privilege their network of INGO contacts, whether they're donors or country office staff that then talk to the main donors, which then privileges the funding. So it sort of protects the funding for them. They're very critical of organizational structures. They said, why is it that we still have country offices that are almost unreconstructed from the way that they were 50 years ago, staffed by mostly white Western or global North project managers, when actually there's lots of very good civil society organizations in the global South that could be doing this work. So they're very, very critical of organizational structures. They're worried about the partnerships modality. They say they're very, very much the words that they used was, you don't really want equitable partnerships. What you really want is just a subcontractor to do some of the work for you, because that's what localization means to some people, is just a subcontracting relationship. They said we really want equitable partnerships. They're worried about fundraising and how we do it. They say, please don't use images that diminish our dignity and our agency, but they still see that. And they said, please, why is it that your organizations are not very diverse? Why is it that they don't include the lived experience of the people who you're trying to help? So this came out in the first consultation, and we've been very thoughtful and mindful about trying to remind ourselves at Peace Direct about these problems and how we can help tackle them within our own organization at Peace Direct, but also the sector. So that was the challenge that was set by Global South actors almost 5 years ago. So where have we got to? Well, before we say the progress, I wanted to just mention briefly the recommendations. So these are recommendations that came directly from a whole series of global conversations over those years. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to link them directly or indirectly to the ACFID code, which I thought was a really interesting piece of work that should have more airtime, I think, in Europe as well, by the way. So the first thing is they said you've got to acknowledge the problem. If you don't acknowledge the problem of systemic racism and power imbalances, you're starving the room of oxygen. People want to have this conversation. Global South actors want to have this conversation with you, but they feel inhibited from doing so because they don't see that you're acknowledging the problem. So acknowledge the problem is absolutely central, and I'm very, very glad to see that your ACFID code 1.1 specifically talks about acknowledging systemic barriers and racism. So that's really, really good start. The second recommendation they had was about adopting a transition mindset for your organizational strategy. So saying, this is who we are right now, this is our organizational purpose, and this is our organizational strategy. But in 5 years' time, we should be different. And by different, we don't mean more of the same, business as usual. We're saying, think about your organizations transitioning into different roles, which decenter yourself and actually place more power and agencies in the hands of the communities that you're trying to serve. Now, I've been a little bit generous because the ACFID code doesn't talk about transition mindsets. What it does talk about under 3.1 and 4.1 is contributing to systemic change under 3.1, and on 4.1, it talks about articulating a clear strategic goal for our work, or strategic goals. So there's an opportunity to think about what that really means for your organizations. Is it more of the same, or are you going to think about a transition? Knowledge generation. The most important recommendation they said was invest in indigenous knowledge generation. So start to move away from us producing the knowledge, but actually investing in the communities producing the knowledge. In 4.2.3, it talks about ethical guidelines for research. So not specifically investing in indigenous knowledge generation, but if you were to follow in the spirit of that, the ethical guidelines, you would have to then, the logical consequence of that is that you are then going to invest in indigenous knowledge generation. Fund more local organizations more generously and with fewer restrictions. So find ways to move away from direct implementation, which a lot of organizations still do, and actually identify local organizations that you can support and fund them. And they say, fund generously and trust courageously, something like that they mentioned to us. So I think we've really got to think about that. How can we be better at that? Now, the code doesn't specifically talk about numbers or the quality of that funding, but there is a general commitment to locally led, so under 2.1.2. Mind your language. So they said, please change the language that you use. Now, that isn't mentioned in the ACFID code. So I think there's a little bit of a gap there, but really think about what language you use, both internally and externally. And there's some pieces of work that have happened in the Global South around proposing alternative terminology. In fact, we were critiqued ourselves. They said we should remove the word aid. It's aid in itself is no longer fit for purpose as a term. We've got to tackle power imbalances by decentering ourselves. So start to dismantle some of the privileged relationships that we hold and actually be and stop ourselves from being the gatekeepers of those relationships and actually enable local organizations to access our contacts and establish relationships with our funders. Now, that is talked about and mentioned specifically in the code 2.1.1, which is great. Rethink the role of country offices. They are largely unreconstructed. One set of activists said that they look very much like neo-colonial outposts, which is pretty hard to hear and pretty damning. But actually, if you look at, and I used to work for Oxfam and various other organizations, I have to admit that was true. We had our gated compound, we had our four-wheel drive, we had our expat staff, and we did things to the community, not with the community, and we didn't really fund the local community groups to have the agency and to lead that work. So how can we rethink the role of country offices? How can we consider possibly even closing country offices and transitioning out of that work and just funding local organizations? There's not enough progress made there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They asked for equitable partnerships with local organizations, and that is mentioned in ACFID Code 5.3. We talk about partnership, members investing time and resources to supporting the sustainability of local partners, and members assessing the effectiveness of their collaborations and partnerships, which is great. Please have a look at the report that we wrote on transforming partnerships. There's a lot of insights from local actors around the world saying partnerships just don't work right now. They are not fit for purpose. So they've asked us to really invest, double down on establishing equitable partnerships with local organizations. And then on fundraising, they said, please, no more poverty porn. You've probably heard this time and time again. There is a lot of critique around the way in which we handle our fundraising and use imagery which diminishes the agency and dignity of the people we're trying to help. They've asked us to stop that for many years. There has been some progress, but not enough. We still see some images being used, particularly when there are emergencies. We tend to then revert to the sort of classic tropes of children with, looking desperate with flies in their eyes, and people, in the Global South are really, really upset by that. I think we have to listen to them. And then finally, recruit differently, ACFID Code 9.1. Now, I think that doesn't actually specifically talk about recruiting differently. It talks about recruitment and our staffing. But what we're being asked to do is to have more diverse workforces, to make sure that we don't just ask for endless master's degrees from various universities, but actually lived experience. And how do we value different types of experience in our workforce? As an example, Peace Direct, when I joined, the non-white population or staff member percentage was 17%. We're about 50% now. We're a much more diverse organization, including staff members who are from those countries who have a lived experience of conflict. So we've made some progress there, and that has changed absolutely qualitatively the way in which the work is being done. So moving on, this very brief slide just shows you the progress or not that's been made. The truth is that there hasn't been enough progress in most of these areas, and this is based again on consultations that we've had with local actors, focus group discussions that we've had. In most areas, there has not been enough progress. I would say that acknowledgement of the problem, there's been good progress. People are acknowledging the problem, and it's so great that that is part of the ACFID code. I think there has been good progress around fundraising. Particularly in Europe, we are seeing fewer and fewer appeals, fundraising appeals that are what has been termed poverty porn. The equitable partnerships work, I think there has been some good progress. I mentioned the Pledge for Change. That's a good example of a commitment being made to really reimagine what partnership should look like. Those are the only areas where there has been good progress. There's been some progress around funding. So, for example, the donor statement on supporting locally led development and the OECD recommendation on enabling civil society has also, I think, triggered some changes within INGOs to say, okay, let's try and provide more flexible funding. Let's provide more unrestricted funding to local organizations. Let's not lock them in this projectized way of working. Let's try and be basic more on trust. Also funders are starting to open their doors directly to local organizations, which is great. So there is some progress there. There has been some progress on language. We do see that some organizations are trying to think much more intentionally about retiring certain words and trying to replace them with others. Oxfam in the UK produced a language guide that I think the right-wing press had a field day about, but was trying to then think about more intentionally about language. So there's some progress there, but look at the ones where it says very little progress. There's been very little progress made on strategies, organizational strategies. There's been very little progress made on knowledge generation. So still, we are producing, global North organizations are still producing so much of the knowledge. Very little progress in terms of decentering ourselves around relationships. We still have our protected relationships with donors, and we haven't really opened the doors or stopped, changed our role as gatekeepers. And there's very little progress around organizational structures. So what is the verdict? The verdict is we must do better. Quite simply, I'm part of a number of networks and movements, one of them the Shift the Power movement, which is hundreds of activists around the world, and local organizations from the Global South are asking us to do more and to be better. They expect that from us, and they don't expect us to go back on our commitments simply because right now the context is very difficult. They say this is an opportunity. See this as an opportunity for transformation. So my final slides then are really just a question and a teaser really for you. Lots of organizations that I've spoken to, and I've spoken, and Peace Direct has spoken to well over 100 INGOs about the future of the sector. And a lot of INGOs say, well, what does this mean for us? Does this mean we close down? Of course it doesn't mean we close down. In fact, most Global South organizations that we've consulted with say, we want your solidarity. We want to work with you. We want your partnership. We want to work with you. But it will mean a radically transformed sector. And so we wrote a report, some of you will have seen it, called The 9 Roles That Intermediaries Can Play in International Cooperation. And I'd encourage you to have a look at it because this was based on our experience and our conversations with our partners about the role that we play. We have no country offices. We do not directly implement anywhere. And so what role can we as an intermediary organization play in imagining a time where we don't even play a role as a funder intermediary? And there were 9 specific roles. Now, I don't have the time to go into that because I want to respect the agenda, but just to say to you that these roles are roles that are highly valued by local organizations. Knowledge broker, being a convener and a connector to strengthen the ecosystem of local actors, to be an advocate for them, to be a watchdog for them because civil society is at risk almost everywhere. Civic space is shrinking. To be their critical friend, and most importantly, to be their sidekick. To reimagine our role, not to be in the driving seat, but to be in the passenger seat alongside them. So please have a look at that report if you can. For me, it does point to a very healthy set of roles that we can play in the future. And I look forward to having a good discussion with you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for that very interesting and provoking discussion and presentation. We do have time for questions, so I would invite people to take themselves off mute, to introduce yourself and which organization you're affiliated with, and to ask your question or to make your comment. Also welcome to have a comment or two. It's easiest if you have the ability to virtually raise your hand, and we can kind of take people in order. But if that's a struggle, then feel free to just take yourself off mute. And if you're not able to speak for some reason, then please feel free to type the question into the chat box as well. I might kick it off, Dylan, with a question. I was reading just noting the context that we're in with the cuts to the aid programs, USAID, these things. I was reading an opinion piece by writer from the development world in the global south, who, development community in the global south. And it was a strongly worded view, basically saying that he welcomed the destruction of the aid system, ecosystem, because it was so rooted in the colonial structures. And whilst acknowledging there's going to be a huge human cost and grieving that, feeling like this is an opportunity for true change. So interested just what you're hearing and what you're thinking in this context, and also how do we advocate for, as we are thinking, what does the next season look like when formal government aid might be less? Is this actually an opportunity for us to be even more creative in what we do?
Thanks, Matthew. Well, the short answer is it is absolutely an opportunity for transformation. And I would say that, I mentioned in my presentation, we've consulted with well over 1,000 activists around the world, 90% of them from the global south, 95% of them from the global south. Not a single local actor that we consulted with wanted the destruction of the sector. They didn't say it is time for you to pack up and close down. What they said was, we want your solidarity, we want your partnership. And for us, that was very encouraging because, we came into this sector. I came into this sector because I care deeply about the communities around the world that need our help. And I think one of the things that I've learned is, and that we've heard, is that in the pursuit of trying to help, we've also done a bit of harm, and that harm hasn't really been recognized, particularly, by the way, in how we've suppressed the growth of indigenous civil society. So local civil society has been squashed by our growth. And just to give you a statistic, we did some analysis for the Shift the Power movement, who released a report called Too Southern to be Funded. Some of you may have seen the report. We analyzed OECD data, and that showed that 93% of all the funding for civil society from OECD-DAC countries goes to INGOs from those countries. So 7% of the funding for civil society goes directly to local organizations. 93% of it actually goes to global north civil society organizations. So we have absolutely suppressed the growth of civil society because we've grown. But actually, to be honest, I don't hear that much anger. What I hear is a request for a transformation. So not a wholesale destruction of the sector, but an opportunity to rethink and to reimagine. So I think that's a really good invitation for us all. We should acknowledge the problem, but we shouldn't beat ourselves up endlessly saying, okay, there's nothing that we can do about it. We can do something about it. We built this sector. It's time for us to reimagine that. Now, there is right now, very sadly, a destruction of civil society caused by not just by US aid and the US government, but also by the dramatic contraction of funding for overseas aid and development around the world. That's going to be causing huge amounts of pain. And actually, what we have said and the discussions that we've been in is that actually transitions have to be thoughtful, have to be something that are managed. They don't have to cause so much pain. We've actually been doing our own piece of research for over 5 years now on responsible transitions. And actually what we're seeing now is a highly irresponsible transition. So as you start to think about your own strategies and your own work and the challenges that your own organizations would face, think about those transitions being responsible and thoughtful and including the local organizations you want to work with rather than unilateral decisions that you make. Because that's even more disempowering, actually, when we make those decisions without the communities and the organizations that we're trying to serve. So I think, yes, it's a terrible situation that we've got right now, and one that we wouldn't recommend to anyone is just, absolute cutting off at the knees. But actually, now that we're here, we've really got to think about what this means in terms of our own roles.
Thank you, Dylan. Let me open up the floor for people to raise their hand or ask a question directly. Julie.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Hamblin. I chair the board of AVI. A really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Really wanted to thank you for it. Lots of food for thought there. There was a reference earlier to compliance requirements, and that's something that I think we all struggle with. We might be quite comfortable to trust our local organisations more, but we feel weighed down by the burden of compliance requirements that are imposed on us by the funders. So how do we get the message through to the funders for them to start working differently? Because very often our hands are tied to a large extent.
Thanks, Judy. I mean, look, that's absolutely right. We're exactly the same. We are bound by the rules that our donors set. But I have to say, I think one of the things that we have, and we've had some discussions and in-depth discussions with INGOs about this. I think the problem is that we have been afraid to challenge our donors. Where we have challenged our donors have been willing to listen. And we have spoken to some of the most inflexible donors in the world. So I think that the first thing to say is we have to be braver as organizations to just push back to our donors, to stop accepting nonsense, and even if that means, by the way, refusing to accept some funding. So we refused to accept some funding from a German donor because actually they said that they wanted to fund local efforts, but actually they wanted 6-week sets of receipts after 6 weeks and only dispersals after 6 weeks, every 6 weeks. I mean, crazy nonsense type requirements that would absolutely paralyze local organizations. So we refused to accept any more funding from them. We wrote them a long letter critiquing their practice, and they invited us in to talk to them about this. And during that conversation, they said, well, actually, some of these things are because of German government rules and regulations, and some of them are about culture and the way that we've been doing things. We're going to change some of the ways that we do things, but some of the things that are linked to German government policy a little bit more difficult, but we pushed back. We said, actually, it's also how you interpret those policies, because sometimes people interpret them in different ways. So I think we've got to be braver, because if we can't do that and push back to our donors, then we're actually aiding and abetting the sort of problems in the sector. It is hard, but in almost every case, even when we're talking to bilaterals, they've found workarounds. So we fund, in some of the most difficult countries in the world, Myanmar, Syria, Sudan, Afghanistan, and we have funding from the Canadian government, the UK government, and actually they've found workarounds. So I think that we need a bit of creativity there. So it's also about understanding what other governments have done. We're about to commission a piece of research on the progressive funding practices of bilateral donors and private philanthropy. And the purpose of that is to show other governments and philanthropy that it is possible. And so maybe that's another piece of the puzzle, is our advocacy, the work that you can do, both individually, but also jointly with ACFID, to engage with the Australian government, but also private philanthropy. So there are always ways. The final thing I would say is that, when I joined the organization, Peace Direct, 10 years ago, 88% of our funding was restricted. 10 years later, it's still 88% or about 82%. So it hasn't changed much. But we are recommitting ourselves to two things. One is to try and raise more money from the general public, because actually we as a sector have become far too reliant on grants and we don't engage with the general public. And they are the ones who can give us our legitimacy, but also can provide unrestricted funding. But the second thing to say is that we have, of that 88% restricted funding, almost, I can't remember how much it is now, but say 2/3 of it is flexible restricted funding. And that's up from 0 when I started. So when I started, there was no flexible funding. It was either highly restricted or unrestricted. What we now have is a lot of very flexible restricted funding. And that's not quite the holy grail. It's not unrestricted funding, but it does enable us to be a lot more flexible with our partners. And we're, given that we're a peace building organization working in the most volatile contexts, flexibility is key. And even when you're not working in volatile contexts, flexibility and adaptability is key. So there are ways in which you can actually tweak the system and tweak the changes with your donors to enable more flexibility. And I would also encourage you to look at your own audit requirements and your own internal practices, because some of these things actually come from us. Maybe one final story is that we have had some consultations with local actors who say, we know that the funding that was being dispersed by the back donor was flexible. It became less flexible when it went through the INGO, because the INGO imposed their own set of rules on top. So I think we also need to look at our own rules and procedures to see whether or not we're being thoughtful enough about really removing some of those requirements. We can't remove all of them, we know that, but I think we could do more.
Thanks, Dylan. We have time for a couple more questions, so let me open the floor up again. Dylan, yeah, go ahead, Sally. Nice to see you, Sally.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you. I'm Sally Moyle. I'm on the board of Plan International Australia and formerly the CEO of Care Australia. And I guess just leading on from the conversation that you started, Dylan, I always thought that the role of INGOs should be to kind of provide an umbrella to crack space for the local partners to have as little compliance and reporting obligations as possible. And I think one of the things that's implicit in your story about your donor partnerships now is that I think private philanthropists in particular are leading the way, I think, aren't they, in giving more flexible funding, in reducing as far as possible reporting requirements and increasing the partnership approach. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that that's having an effect on bilateral donors as well, and if they're learning from the philanthropists.
Yes and no. Yes, you're absolutely right that private philanthropy has led the way, and they're fortunate. It's their money. They can take risks, and what we hear from government is, yes, those examples are good, but they don't translate very well and translate very easily because governments tend to use, well, of course, we know the bureaucracy that surrounds government funding. But they have been very, very useful, I guess, provocateurs in the sector. So, for example, the Hilton Foundation has been sort of spearheading some of the work around locally led development. They did some work with USAID, and they're working with Peace Direct right now on how can we continue to advance the locally led agenda despite what's happening with the US government. So they can play that role. But what we also know, and this is where I really want to encourage you all to think about this, is that the changes are coming from two other places. The changes are also coming from INGOs pushing. They're coming from INGOs saying, we can't continue to maintain the status quo because it doesn't feel right ethically. And it's also coming from Global South actors who are more and more vocal. They're fed up. And actually, so for example, the UK government, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, held a global consultation on what they should do with their funding for civil society. And what they did was, rather than just asking an INGO to manage that process, they asked the West Africa Civil Society Institute, so a Ghanaian-based Global South organization, to work with them. They held a series of global conversations and regional conversations, and they produced a report, which the FCDO did not want to release for over a year, because actually it says we've got to do better. The UK government has got to do better. So actually, Global South organizations are really also pushing. Now, if we have the INGOs pushing, Global South organizations pushing, and private philanthropy pushing, all of those are helping the bilaterals change. And, you know, let's not forget, before this new US administration, it was USAID who were really leading the way when it came to the commitments that they were making around locally led. I mean, Samantha Power in 2022 made a set of remarkable commitments around how USAID would change. Obviously, now we look at what's happened in the US, and it's extremely sad with the closure of USAID. But that also shows me, and I use that example because USAID, the first change that they made when they made that commitment was to change their risk appetite statement, because they understood that in order to make the changes, to make those commitments real, they had to change their whole approach to risk management. And that then spurred on other donors. The UK government said, okay, if USAID can do that, surely we can do that. So I think that it is coming from other places. We've all got to play that role. Private philanthropy right now is likely to be under attack in the US because the US administration is coming after all progressive causes. So you might actually find private philanthropy being preoccupied with its own survival right now, and maybe we need to step up and do more. So we can't, my final word here, we probably can't wait for private philanthropy to continue to play that sort of thought leadership role. It may not happen in the coming months and years ahead.
Thanks, Dylan. We have time for one more question, if there's anybody who had one that they were waiting to ask. And if not, I'm going to take the privilege of being the moderator to ask just for a couple of practical examples of how NGOs can tackle that question of strategy and how you change the way you do strategy. So for the board members sitting around the table here, there's a traditional approach to strategy, and it often involves going out and listening to stakeholders. But what would a transformed way of grappling with strategy look like, and maybe a practical example of what you've seen that's good practice?
It's a great question. I mean, Matthew, to be honest, I'm not sure what a different approach to the strategy development process is. I think you could probably use the same tools and approaches. We've just developed a new strategy, and we used very traditional approaches, looking at our core competencies, looking at interviewing all of our partners, making sure that they were part of that process. I think the difference is more about how we see ourselves in the world, and actually recognizing that current strategies aren't really fit for purpose. So, if we start a strategic planning process saying, actually, we still want to grow, or actually we still want to maintain our reach and our footprint, I think that's the problem. We need to be able to have everything on the table, actually start to test all of those assumptions. And I think we also have to have a different metric. As board, I'm on a number of boards. As I said, I'm the chair of the board of Civicus. I sit on a number of boards. I still see that so many boards still look at income growth as a proxy for impact. So we look at our growth and the figures as a way of demonstrating how successful we are and how impactful we are. And that's crazy. We should be looking at much more nuanced set of indicators, and also not ones that necessarily are about scale. Actually, I think the reality is, and this might be hard for us all to accept, is the sector is going to be smaller in the future. And that's the right thing for us, because actually, if we want to rebalance that equation between the 93% of funding that goes to INGOs in the global north and the 7% that goes directly to local organizations, global south organizations should have a much, much, much bigger slice of the pie. If they're going to have a bigger slice of the pie, unless the pie increases in size, which is not happening anytime soon, then the funding for us is going to be smaller. So actually, I think we should be starting to say to ourselves, what could a strategy look like that sees us half our size and yet still is something that we can be proud of? That we as organizations are super proud of the fact that actually we've shrunk in size, but in doing so, we've helped grow the organizations that we support. Civil society has grown and strengthened, and the ecosystem of local actors has strengthened in the countries that we care about. And yes, that might mean that we are a smaller organization because we've used our power and our positionality to leverage funding that goes directly to those organizations. How can we see that as success? So I think it's much more a sort of conceptual framing about what we understand as success. Because right now, I imagine that every one of us around this virtual table would say that if we shrunk, that would be a failure. And actually, I think that we've got to radically think differently about that, because in the future, the sector will be smaller, and that's not a problem. I think as long as the communities have benefited and all those issues that we care about, the lives of people improve, then it's okay if we shrink. And so maybe that's my final word is it's not necessarily the answer you wanted, Matthew, about the sort of process, but it's certainly about the way in which we even understand what strategy is and our purpose.
Thank you, Dylan. Let me just say on behalf of everyone who's on this call, and we did record it, and we're going to share it a little bit more widely with our members as well. But thank you for your time. Thank you for your thought leadership. Thank you for your provocations. I think it was really interesting seeing how you mapped the code against some of these locally led, the requests from the Global South on what good change looks like. And you've given us some things maybe to feel good about, but also some areas where we can continue to reconsider how the code continues to evolve. But also, I think as each of us as leaders of our organization thinks about how we can change internally, the other thing that you've really encouraged us to think about is how do we actively change the system and push back and be part of that change. So it's not just about us being different, but us using our voice and our resources to help change the whole system. So thank you for that. I appreciate your time. I know it's a busy time for everybody right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone. Good luck for the rest of the session.
Thanks. Good. We're going to transition to a practical example from one of our members who we invited to share about their own journey. And the organization is called This Life Cambodia. Billy Gorger is the founder and executive director of This Life. He's had a long-standing career in the field of international development and conservation, designing and delivering social justice initiatives, initially in Australia, and for the last 15 years in Cambodia. With a background including conservation, education, equality, and human rights, Billy's expertise in partnering with and working in the best interests of local communities has led him to be a member of a mentor to other NGOs in this field. Also an international awards judge and an international speaker on these different topics. So really pleased to have Billy with us today, sharing. Also, I think all of us can commiserate with him. I think it's the first day of the organizational review process with DFAT on site. And I think very few of us at the end of that first day would be having the energy to do a webinar and share something, much less. So thank you for doing that in the midst of a busy week for you.
Thanks, Matthew. I'll just quickly share my screen and just make sure if I share like this, are you just seeing the slide or are you also seeing the notes section on the right-hand side?
It looks like we're seeing the notes.
Oh.
I think Billy's frozen.
Terrible time to freeze. Okay, I think I'm back.
Yes, you're back.
Okay, sorry. Were you seeing the slide or were you seeing notes as well?
Notes, we were seeing notes as well.
Notes as well. Okay, so let me just work out how to share this.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, it has been a long day, and we're going for ANCP accreditation, so it's not an actual review, unfortunately.
All right.
Yeah, so it's even more complex. So let's start that. How about that?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, great. So like a quick introduction. My name is Billy Gorter. I'm the executive director of This Life. I'm also the founder of This Life as well. The organization started in 2007, and we have always been based in Cambodia. Our programs have always operated from community-driven dialogues. And I was a little bit nervous to follow on from Dylan, but I feel a little bit more comfortable now that a lot of what he said resonates with our organization. So I'm confident to now take this forward and have this chat with you. So when we talk about locally led development from our perspective, we actually are headquartered in Cambodia. So our headquarters is in country. 100% of our operational staff, including finance and partnerships development, are all based in Cambodia, myself included. And we've always worked from a community-driven dialogue perspective where we look at the problems, the root cause, the possible solutions, and then community priorities. So we've always known that communities are the experts when identifying like practical solutions and should be the ones who are prioritizing their own needs. And we've worked alongside them. So our mission literally is to listen to, engage with, and advocate side by side children, women, families, and communities as they identify practical solutions to their own complex needs. Around like the true power transfer and beyond consultation to community ownership, this is a little bit weird for me because I am an Australian. I have been based in Cambodia for the last 20 years, but I still have that privilege of leading the organization. And I honor that privilege by ensuring that the team are actually like the power, the decision makers, and they own the power within the organization, and the communities themselves direct our strategy. So when Dylan was talking about before, he doesn't know how to do strategy around being locally led. We actually have a very practical way that we do that. And it starts from like the bottom up, and it's community-driven dialogues. So the community-driven dialogues are really the starting point of our strategy. We don't create our strategy until we've conducted community-driven dialogues, and then pre-program assessments, and then operational plans. And then those are all synthesized into a strategy document that then goes to our governance board, and our governance board in Australia looks at that and holds us to account to ensure that we are delivering on the KPIs that we've set as an organization. So the community-driven dialogues really have multiple touch points. It ranges, for example, we work in prisons in Cambodia. So we work with and speak to children who have been in conflict with the law, who have served custodial sentences. We speak to their families. We speak to subnational mechanisms. We speak to national authorities and ministries as well. And we collect the data and understand where it is communities want to go. We use culturally appropriate tools in Cambodia. So we use problem trees, mapping, preference ranking, and so forth, and ensuring that, again, communities are identifying the problems, root cause, possible solution, and the priority is what we work alongside. We're about building consensus, and community-wide agreement really informs all the programs that we do. 100% of our programs have come from community-driven dialogues. We've never started a program that hasn't come from communities. However, we have adapted a program to support Safer Children International, where we were using tools that we were using with children who were in conflict with the law, and seeing if those tools would translate for children who are coming out of residential care institutions. And that model became very successful here in Cambodia as well. So when we talk about dialogue to action, all our programs are driven by communities' voices. The programs emerge directly from community identified needs and priorities, and we look at testing and scaling alongside those communities. So we run a range of programs, and we have conducted thousands of community-driven dialogues across the country. In those dialogues, like there are normally 3 top priorities that communities address, and that being gender-based violence, drug use and dependencies, and migration is normally up the top there as well. Looking at that, and when we started in 2009 and really started to look at where communities were coming from, communities were raising the issue of children who were in conflict with the law not returning to their community after serving their custodial sentence. At this stage, we were working in education, and our primary focus was in education. But we decided very early on, we were founded in 2007, we decided very early on in 2009 that we would test we would test where the knowledge of communities and why particular communities were raising certain issues. So we took communities' input. We looked at the issue of children in conflict with the law and recidivism. And then we went to the prison in Siem Reap, and we literally mapped out and put a pin in the map for every single person that was in prison and which community that they came from. So the community who identified it as their number one, their top priority, had the highest number of prisoners incarcerated in Siem Reap in Cambodia. So it really made sense for them as a community to address this and prioritize this. And us having little knowledge in that space really took that upon ourselves to understand the community views, understand the reasons why children weren't returning to community, understanding the issues children were having within prisons, and looking at the government policies and processes and laws that were in place. We then co-created solutions, and we co-created solutions around what was available to us in Cambodia at the time. So in 2009, there were no juvenile justice laws. Those juvenile justice laws were drafted in 2002. They weren't enacted until 2017. So we did what we could under the laws and the provisions that we had access to in Cambodia. So that was to work directly with children in prison, in Siem Reap in Cambodia, and to address the root cause of the issue of them not returning home. When we understood the issue, it was around family connection and around the issues that children faced and families faced, visiting children who are incarcerated. And we literally broke down those barriers for families. We ensured that families were able to visit without paying informal fees. We made sure that families were connected with children inside prison. And we made sure that we provided vocational training skills and provided support and personal development opportunities to those children in prison. When we did our research, recidivism rates were at 60% within 6 months. Over the last 15 years, we've been able to reduce those recidivism rates down to under 2%. And again, this was literally a conversation that we had with communities, and we took that forward and we drove forward with their ideas and their practical solutions. And one was literally driving families to the prison, ensuring that no informal fees were paid, and providing that space for families to reconnect with their children. Since 2017, in 2017, the government implemented juvenile justice laws. Those laws were not utilized in Cambodia until 2020, when This Life perception tested what the government thought was critical community outrage in regards to diversion and the utilization of diversion. So we tested that theory and we looked at and we listened to communities, and communities came back very strongly stating that they were completely fine with diversion. They were fine with alternatives to custodial sentences. So in 2020, after releasing a report called No Place for a Child, Alternatives to Imprisoning Children in Cambodia, we gave that to the Ministry of Social Affairs, and within 2 months, we had an MOU signed to create the first diversion program in Cambodia, which has been so successful that we've reduced the number of children in Siem Reap prison by 30%, while the rest of the country has seen an increase of juvenile incarceration by 500% on average in every other province. So we have had hundreds of children go through diversion options and alternatives. And again, this all goes back to 2009 when communities identified that as a problem. 95% of our staff are Cambodian, so all our finances, we're registered in Australia, obviously. We're members of ACFID. We have ACNC registration and now going for ANCP accreditation. All our functions come from Cambodia. So our HR, our admin, our finance, our program delivery, our strategic partnerships are all in Cambodia in-house. And just to reflect a little bit and a story around the knowledge that is held within country and being that privileged white person to be able to speak on this, but one of our staff, our first staff members, is an incredible human being, was selected from 300 applicants, has worked through the organization, is an Obama fellow, has done a one-on-one interview with Obama only 2 years ago. But this incredible person is really like leading the organization. I am supporting him and the rest of the team to enable those programs and that operation to work and to fill what the ANCP and ACNC requires of us as an Australian organisation. There's a few of our board who are on this call as well, so I'd like a big shout out to them for joining. And again, our board is 100% Australian, although we do have members who were born in Cambodia who are on our board. But again, 95% of our staff are local. The key learnings from the, I guess, the application of being locally led is that it does take time, and we have seen like shifts in strategy